Okay, so I'm going to make a start now. So firstly, I'd like to just thank everyone for joining in this session today, where we'll be discussing baby loss within South Asian communities. My name is Madhuri Bedi, and I work for SANS as a bereavement support service officer. And my focus is on South Asian communities and how we deal with baby loss. SANS charity has been supporting bereavement families for 40 years. Their vision is to have a world where fewer babies die, and when a baby does die, anyone affected receives the best possible care and support for as long as they need it. I would like to take this opportunity to firstly offer my sincerest gratitude to SANS for taking the initiative to raise awareness of such an important subject. And I'd also like to thank the panel members for kindly giving their time to join us. I think most of us here today, may have been impacted by baby loss in some way. So above all, I'd really like to thank you for joining us today. You may be a parent who's lost a baby many years ago, or you may have lost more recently. It could be that you have joined because you have been touched by the loss of a baby. Whatever your reason, our sincerest hope is that we are offering to you today exactly what you are looking for, and that together we can change the narrative and start to raise the most important subject that can be a silent secret that brings with it so much stigma and taboo. And just to let you know, the panel discussion will last 45 minutes, after which we welcome you to stay with us to ask any questions you may have, or to share with us your own experience, should you wish to. It's really important to us that this session is an inclusive and interactive one, and therefore we request you share your questions or comments for the panel through the chat box to enable us to collectively discuss these after the panel discussion ends, and we then move on to an interactive session, which we hope you will stay for. Most important thing to remember today is that this session may be triggering, so please do look after yourself. Our helpline is open until 9 p.m. today, and again, it will be open from 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, should you wish to speak to one of our bereavement support service advisors. We will, throughout the session, in the chat box, add our contact details for all of the services that we provide, and that will include the phone number. So now what I'd like to do is introduce you to the panel members, and then we will get started. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Sheetal Savi Joshi. I am mum to 3 wonderful boys, 2 who are with me, and 1 Shivai, who unfortunately passed away when he was 8 months old. I'm also mum to 3 other babies whose heartbeats we never got the chance to hear. For some time now, I've been talking about baby loss, more so after Shivai died, and in some ways it has healed my own kind of grief, and at the same time connected me to so many people who have been very supportive of our own journey around baby loss. And that has transpired into becoming an ambassador with SANS, and now also a board of trustee member. So I do a lot of work with SANS and Madhuri in terms of kind of taking the support services out to the community and the wider bereavement community. And just really grateful to be here today on the panel.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Saz. We lost our son 30 years ago. I am a mother of 2 others who are still with me, so I'm a mother of three sons. My journey to actually embrace my grief only started recently in 2017, when I suffered immense panic attacks and anxiety and couldn't really cope with, in effect, living. So I had really good counselling this time around, and from that I began to talk about my grief, and also started to go back to a story that I'd written in 2006 when I'd first started writing about what had happened in the hospital with our son, and he has led me to do what I do now, which is actually write stories about stigma and grief and loss in my storytelling and talk about it all the time in these type of discussions.
Thank you, Saz.
Hi, my name's VJ. My son Josh died shortly after delivery in 2019. My wife went through a normal labour. Shortly into labour, after arriving at the hospital, she had kind of extreme pain. Quite a rare complication was diagnosed, a uterine rupture, something I'd never heard of before. Joshua was delivered by emergency caesarean. Although he was resuscitated afterwards, he only survived 7 hours. We had our inquest this year, which concluded there were some errors at the hospital, some equipment they didn't have, and there should have been some actions taken earlier. I haven't spoken to anyone about my grief, so this is all quite new to me. A lot of my journey and recovery was very much focused on trying to understand what had happened and focusing on the inquest. Because of COVID, the inquest took 3 years to happen. So I'm happy to share our story and help in any way I can.
Thank you, Vijay.
Hi everybody, my name is Binish Nazmeen. I'm an assistant professor in midwifery, but before I started this role, I was a specialist cultural liaison midwife. My role and my niche and my passion is addressing health inequalities within maternity services, and I sit on a few panels which look at adverse outcomes that are faced by Black, Asian and people from diverse ethnic backgrounds. And one of those panels is Embrace Panel, which is a national confidential inquiry, and we review when there has been mortality, so when there has been a loss of mothers or babies. And I'm bringing some midwifery and some specialist knowledge to the discussion today. But apart from my professional role here and discussion, I'm also, I know family members who have been affected by loss and who have only spoken up 30 years later, 40 years later, and that's because they know I'm a midwife. They know I work in this area, in this arena, and once they know I'm a midwife, they have literally spoken for the first time sometimes about losing their child. And it's often a conversation done in hushed tones in private rooms. And I think it's important that we have safe spaces where we can have these conversations, so healing can be commenced and questions can be answered and conversations can be had.
Thank you, Vinesh. That's really, really important and so good to have you on the panel. And so are you, yeah? I think Ansa was admitted. And so are you here?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, there's a bit of an echo, but let's try. And try now.
Would you like me to speak and introduce myself?
Please.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, please do.
Hi. So my name is Ansa, and I'm the founder and CEO of Hope Support Services. You can also find us online by typing hopebereavementsupport.com. I myself am a mother in 2013. Can you hear me, Madhuri?
It's really
Can you hear me, Madhuri?
echo. I'm just going to ask everyone else if they've got that echo as well. Is it cutting off?
Madhuri, I think there may be a broadband width issue, which can sometimes happen. So if Ansa takes off her video, then hopefully they should be able to hear Ansa a little bit better.
And so could you just repeat what you said, because it's so important? Could we just try again? Thanks.
Yes, my name is Ansa. Can you hear me clearly now?
Yeah, we can now, yes.
My name is Ansa M. And I'm the CEO and founder of Hope Support Services. You can find us online on a social media platform by searching for Hope, Support, or for Hope. Myself, the mother of 9 rainbow children who've passed over and didn't make it to this dunya. And that's why I passionately set up support for other women who go through child loss. But we do a lot more than just child loss now as Madhu.
And so it is still breaking up, and I think some people are struggling to hear you. But what we'll do is we will share your link in the chat so that people can, reach your services. I don't know if you heard Ansa is the founder of.
Can you hear me now, Madhuri?
Yeah, just try for a second. Just try.
Yeah, I've tried everything on here and I don't know why.
That's good. That's good. Now we can hear you. So we got parts of it, but I think, the important thing is that Ansa is the mother to 9.
Okay, that's not from me. I'll wait to speak again later, if that's okay, Madhuri.
Yeah, we can hear you though now. And so if you could just add that part that you said about the 9 baby rainbow children and what then you went on to do.
I set up Hope Bereavement Support to help women from all communities who suffer child loss.
Yeah, and that is so commendable that you use your pain to help so many. So we will hear from Ansa more shortly. As a lot of people have joined now, I just want to reiterate that we are recording this. So if anyone is uncomfortable with their camera on, please do feel free to turn it off. So, what we know is grief is not selective. Bereaved parents come from diverse backgrounds, cultures, and circumstances. There are common threads, but in every experience, there is its own uniqueness. Without question, one shared thread should be that bereaved parents are given much needed support by everyone around them, be it their family, friends, wider community, health and care workers, educators, and employees. Sadly, we know this is not the case. I want to start our panel discussion by sharing with you a graphic that will no doubt resonate with many people who have joined us today. Can you all see that? So these comments are just a few that are said, mostly to bereaved mothers who are trying to navigate their way through the immense shock, grief, trauma, and isolation that comes with losing a baby. Sadly, there is a lot more that is said. I recently was speaking to somebody who had stillbirth, and she told me that her mother-in-law had said to her that her fate, this fate of losing her child, was because she had washed her hair during the 9 months of pregnancy. And, I felt so upset because in her head, she was in so much grief that she was actually mulling that is this my fault? And what I can't understand is in this day and age, these things are still said and also accepted when all they do is cause further distress and impact on mental and physical, health and well-being. I'm often asked that question, why is baby loss within the South Asian communities? Why does it carry so much stigma and taboo? So I'd like to open the panel discussion with this question. So what I'd like to understand is why does baby loss within the South Asian community differ from other communities? And why is the emphasis of loss mainly on the mother? So Ansa, I think we can hear you clearly now. So as a mother, you've just shared that you've lost 9 babies. Could you please start us off on this question?
Of course, yes. I hope you can still hear me. Yeah. And it's not going to break off. There's a horrible thunderstorm coming our way. The skies have turned horrible dark grey, so I think that's got a lot to do with it as well.
We can hear you clearly now. Thank you.
Child loss is very isolating, no matter what background you come from, as I have found in many years of work in this field. But I think from when you add culture, faith, customs, obligations, expectations, the list goes on and on. It becomes even more complex. The grieving actually becomes more complex. And when you're isolated, and then you're already going through that grieving process of looking at self-blame, you know, that I'm broken, did I do something wrong? And then you've got other people validating that. You've got other people saying, especially like, I'm really sorry to hear the comments you made about this lady who was told you washed your hair. You know, I can't even begin to tell you the list I have would be too long, and I'll take up too much time. So, but yes, my experience is that culturally it makes it more difficult. If you look at it from a faith perspective, I can speak clearly from an Islamic faith perspective. It's meant to be more supportive, and I believe that's the case in the Sikh faith as well, and in the Hindu faith, in terms of how you're nurtured, how you're healed towards recovery. Even the Buddhist, also, I know lots of Chinese women who was spoken about the 40 days. The Persians, the Arabs, they all, different parts of the world, all celebrate and actually support the mother when she has a child. And if she loses a child, from a faith perspective, it's meant to be even more support. But then the culture takes over, and it's not the case, sadly.
You're very right there. So I wonder, is there an intergenerational difference or any privilege in how we then grieve? So if I can address that to all the panel.
I'd like to come back on that quickly and just say that,
please.
Yes, intergenerationally, there is a difference in how grieving is handled. I think the older generation have a higher expectation or expectation of a threshold to withhold pain and suffering and not to complain. It's about being patient, and it's about showing your virtue and your honor, and not to be shameless and to cry or show weakness. And I think the younger generations now do embrace talking about mental health, do embrace talking about emotional issues a lot more easier than the older generations. I don't know how everybody else feels on the panel.
Yeah. So SARS, I think you're going to say something.
It is definitely something to do with a generational issue, but I also think that a lot of it is that women have always been told that if you lose a child, whether it is a miscarriage or whether in when you've got babies that die, you know, children that die, that a lot of it is, well, it's God's will, you know, it's going to happen. We're prone as a community from the subcontinent to actually almost leave everything to God, instead of, hold on a sec, why have I lost 9 children? Why have I had 9 miscarriages? I need to check this out. But instead what happens is that nobody encourages you to check it out. Nobody encourages you to seek mental health support. Nobody encourages you to discuss it. They just completely forget that you've lost that child. So it's culture. That's the culture that probably ran because of the fact that we all come from villages and immigration. But it's also even educated families still do similar sort of thing. So it is all about, it's God's will. So there's a spirituality that is unique in our community, but it's also a hindrance.
Yeah. And this is something Banash and I were talking about just earlier today, in fact. So I don't know, Banash, if you can come in here.
I mean, I think if we talk about stigma and stigmatized issues, and also trauma, trauma can, if it's not addressed appropriately, it leads to us developing these coping mechanisms, which are the only things we know, and it's a form of survival, and you go to what you know and you rely on that. So if you haven't had the healing for that trauma, you can then sometimes become disassociative. So you disassociate from the feeling, which means you almost appear harsher. And then if that healing hasn't happened in your lifetime, and then your children and their children are doing this, then you can't understand why they're not behaving the way you did. You know, this is intergenerational trauma. It's the lessons we learned from our parents, and how that cycle can continue, and how at some point we've got to think about what healing we need, and healing comes in many different ways and different forms and coping mechanisms. There's healthy versions, there's unhealthy versions, and we don't have the conversations about them. We don't learn about how to have healthy coping mechanisms and how to have those healthy conversations around these things. So how can we then talk about such an emotive, often hushed topic with our families and explore it? Often you find, you know, in my profession, that people feel like they need to have confidentiality. They feel like they can't talk about certain things if they know someone who's familiar or within the community around in certain areas. So they wouldn't want support or peer support groups to be in certain locations that are high prevalent. And we think we're doing helpful things by putting them in locations where it's easier for access. But sometimes they need it to be away from that, to keep confidentiality, to have the safe space, to have those conversations, because when they go home, this is sometimes the reactions they have. And, you know, unfortunately, our elders sometimes are now beyond the point of learning and opening up. And we can't always be the children they need us to be, just like they can't sometimes be the parents we need them to be. But we still need to have those healthy spaces for us and those mechanisms that we know work for us, and reach out for them.
And I think that's why the work that SANS does, and Unsung does also, where so much of it is, there is that safe, supportive space. It is online or the telephone, or that does help, because it is that easy access whenever you need it. But I know that Sheethal wanted to come in with this.
Yeah, I was just going to talk about kind of, that sort of conversation that happens around family members. And I remember I hadn't even got pregnant with my first son, but I was married, and there was somebody else whose party or something that we had gone to. And I remember a few aunties turning around and said, when you get pregnant, don't say anything until 3 months. It's not good to say anything. So even like from a fear perspective, it's almost like put into your mind not to say anything from even before you're pregnant, And I remember sort of, unfortunately, living with that fear from the moment I got pregnant. And then I remember when the first miscarriage happened, there were several people that, instead of acknowledging the loss that we had just been through, had kind of said, well, at least you can get pregnant.
Yeah.
And it was very dismissive of the baby that we had first lost.
Yeah.
And I often wonder if my actions back then had played differently, had those conversations not happened, and had I not acknowledged that what was being said was not right. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when we talk about kind of the intergenerational kind of difference, I remember when Shivai died, people came over to sort of support us during that time. And, we were really thankful for that, because the first thing that I wanted around me was my family. I just wanted to feel love, because I felt like the love had been taken away from us. And I remember sitting on the sofa, and it just happened by chance. And all of a sudden there was 4 of us sitting on the sofa. There was one lady who was like my grandma, and there were 2 other ladies who were like my aunts. And then there was me. And all of a sudden they just came up with it. The grandma was saying to me, I had a baby that was stillborn. And then the other one said, I had a baby that died in a car accident. And then another lady said, I had a baby that died when they were one day old. And all of a sudden I was just so shocked, because it was the first time I'd ever heard this. Mm-hmm. And the conversation was just all around the support that I was given during that time, mental health services and support that I was given, and the conversation around what they were told, unfortunately, by professionals, plus also family members, that, well, it's happened, just get on with it and try for another one. And unfortunately, it just broke my heart almost, that, I almost felt like I was offering them sort of services and support that I'd found out because of my own personal situation. And they turned around and said, it's too late for us. Yeah. There's nothing that can be done now for us.
Thank you for sharing that, Sheetal. And so has her hand up, so we'll take a quick question.
Just a quick comment, really, just to share with everybody here, something called the mother's wound. We're talking about intergenerational, differences within loss. And I think Banash mentioned something about trauma. Being trauma trained and specialists, we learned that we do actually pass on trauma through the generations, through our DNA as well. So the mother's wound is about how we as women, when we carry our children, especially our female babies, we are therefore also carrying the next generation, because all the eggs are formed inside that female baby, inside our womb. So whatever that pregnancy is like for our maternal grandmother, whatever's going on for her, around her, and a lot of, including my own family members, would have gone through the actual split of Hindustan into Pakistan and India, and all of that going on for them, losing their home, losing their families, losing their identities. It was, I think all this comes into play when you start investigating and looking at how we heal, truly heal, and not just now, but from past trauma as well, from a generational perspective.
Thank you. Everything that everyone has shared is, we've just sort of, I've asked 2 questions and I want to go so much further into depth in depth of this, but we're going to have to move on to the next question. But thank you all. So the other thing I've often sort of heard and parents tell me is that there is a difference in their pregnancy, delivery and postnatal care that they receive. And again, I've done internally, we've discussed this in SANS, and it seems to go hand in hand with the maternity inequalities that we're aware of in Black and South Asian communities. So Banash, could I just come back to you and see, if you could just share with me what your experience is as a midwife in this, and then if anyone else wants to join, they can.
Absolutely. I suppose I would normally go at this very professionally, but just after our conversation today, Madhuri, I had a conversation with another friend, and that friend told me, because I said I'm going to be attending this webinar, and she told me that her friend had recently just, not had a loss, but experienced maternity services. And she is married to, they're an interracial couple. She's married to a white man, and she felt that in her care, she was treated differently when she was on her own. And when her partner, who is white, was present, she saw a change in her care. Now, I trained in NHS. I worked in the NHS for over a decade, and I have been away. I've worked in the UAE, I've worked in private healthcare, and I've seen racial injustice across the board in various different ways. It can be more overt sometimes abroad, but in the UK, it's a little bit more covert. It's difficult. And, I run training around cultural safety and competency. And it's one of those things that isn't about, what is unconscious bias and how do you make sure it doesn't, affect the way you care, and a tick box exercise, which is often an hour long, because you can't unpick a lifelong and multi-generational attitudes in an hour, because some of the people who are in leadership are, in my parents' time, they were children of skinheads. They were actively attacking Asian men, women, in the streets. So these are people who are making decisions for everybody. And, it may be that they've changed and their attitudes have changed and their values are no longer the same. But unless we actively unpick and are conscious that we don't let those filter down, and when you've had a stressful day, when you're short-staffed and you've not had a break, you've not been to the toilet, we know the stresses that go on working in the NHS 12-hour shifts, then you're more likely to be inclined to not have those filters because you're running on empty. So those behaviors can manifest in the way you treat people. And it's sad, it's a reality. It's why the NHS right now has got a, equality, diversity, equitable care and continuity of care has been on the agenda. for improving these outcomes, and there's a strong investment in training staff appropriately, but it goes all the way to the medical curriculum, the midwifery curriculum. You know, we are still training people to look for deterioration depending on the color of your skin. If you know, we talk about blueness around the lips for cyanosis. If you're deteriorating, well, you know, I go grey actually, so do my colleagues. Redness for signs of inflammation and sepsis. Well, actually in the black skin tone, it goes darker, so it gets more melanated. No, it doesn't go red. If it goes red, then there's something really wrong, or someone's got paint on there. You know, these kind of things are still part of the curriculum. An ITU nurse, I had this conversation with her 2 weeks ago, and she said, I've been working in ITU and I've never thought about it from that perspective. And no one has trained me to think about it from that perspective. Our machines, you know, our oxygen saturation machines are less likely to pick up desaturation of oxygen in people who have more melanin in their skin. So if you have a darker skin tone and you're deteriorating, it's identified later. So it's these multiple layers of things that are happening, from, you know, bias, and that can be racial, to systemic issues, to training, and it's compounding and making this situation where we are seeing these outcomes.
Oh, that's so interesting. So sad. Part of what you say is so sad, and it's so important that that training is given to ensure that this stops. And SANS is doing an inquiry on this, and working with people like yourself to hopefully see that change. Ansa, I know you have your hand up.
I'm just listening to Banash and thinking, wow, it's not changed. And my experiences have been just as shocking. And we're talking 2008, where I asked for a birthing mat for my husband to lay down on the floor. And I was told quite openly, covertly, not overtly, he should be used to sleeping on the floor where he comes from. He can sleep on the floor. And that was a white midwife, a senior midwife within the maternity care that I was given during delivery. And I had lost my baby, you know, and it's interesting what Banash said about the skin tones, because I actually I lose a lot of blood when I went through my losses, and I'd gone yellow. Now, obviously, when we start getting light or anything, we start going yellow. We don't go pale as in white, we go yellow. And I was getting pale, I was going to collapse. And this senior midwife was adamant that I was fine and shoving me around. And I collapsed in front of everybody in the team. There were lots of apologies, but nothing came of it. Nobody would dare speak up or put a formal complaint or take it further. And it just felt you as a patient were invalidated, and I was vulnerable. I was spoken over many times. My husband was right next to me, yet he was the one spoken to instead of me. He couldn't speak a word of English. It was only me who could speak English, but they'd assume you was the one who could speak.
Yeah.
And I think there's, you talked about pregnancy itself. I think I want to go back to the topic of culture in South Asian communities and talk about pregnancy. It is celebrated, but it is also massively, and we can't negate from this or invalidate the fact that superstitious beliefs are part of the culture. Okay, that's part of the culture. You can't take it away. And in some faiths, it is part of the faith also. Okay, some African tribes and like places and countries, they actually, voodoo is part of their faith. Okay, so they believe in the belief in this is quite intense and quite to the core identity of somebody. So pregnancy is very protected. Even in the Roman travelers community, a pregnant woman cannot look at a picture of a pregnant woman because it's believed that she'll miscarry. Okay, Bangladeshi women do not access antenatal services until they're at least 28 weeks gone, because they believe it will cause a miscarriage. So that's the pregnancy side of it. It's celebrated, but it's really secretly celebrated. When you're going through the labor, it's again a private affair. Men are to be kept away from it. New generations will bring the men in, okay? But still from a faith perspective, some don't do that. They keep it segregated. Aftercare for women who lose a child is still atrocious. It's a massive miss. It's not completely there.
It's, you know, the NHS worked really, really hard, and I know my aftercare was hit and miss, and there was some wonderful people. And I think, like Banash says, it's really, really hard. They're doing very long shifts, and we have to take that on board. But I too can say that if, you know, I had been selected rather than the person the white lady in the bed next to me to have a strep B test, my baby would be here today. But even though I requested it, that didn't happen.
But does
So
that make it fair, Madhuri? Does it make it fair to say,
It's
oh,
not.
we're stretched
It's
out,
not.
oh,
Yeah.
we've got no capacity, and
doesn't.
that's why we're making it? It's like the
Yeah.
pandemic pandemic has highlighted it even more. Yes, the NHS, when they're on form, they're doing an incredible job.
Yeah.
I think the people, I mean, I've worked, you know this, from a strategic level with the universities on the training side, as Binash is saying, right at the beginning, what do we look at the curriculum? What are we teaching the professionals who are going to be supporting the public? But when you're working on all those levels for years and years, you do start to see a pattern. And the pattern is when they're fresh and new into the system and doing a job, they're very passionate and they want to do everything they can to be completely inclusive. But when you've been in that cycle, completely being battered again and again with your time, with your pressures, with your targets, everything starts to slide. And what slides first? Your attention to the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what's happening. Or she's not going to be able to speak up and complain about me. So it's all right. I'll leave it to the end and I'll go do somebody else right now. You know? I'm sorry. I'm getting really passionate about it now.
No, we all are, Binash. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you, but this is where I come back to two things. And, you know, I was recently co-chair for the Birthrights Inquiry into Racial Injustice in UK Maternity Services, and they saw stereotypes were affecting Black communities and Asian communities about pain and pain thresholds. You know, one community, apparently the pain couldn't cope with pain and the other one was strong, but these stereotypes were about these communities, but the outcome was the same. Neither of the communities were getting pain relief when they were asking for it. So people are asking, people are informing, people are advocating for themselves, so are their families. We are still failing to listen. So this is definitely the responsibility of the practitioners. Why are they failing to listen? Because we, as one of the community members, I know that we don't complain. We'll complain behind closed doors. We'll go complain to your family midwife member. But when I say, okay, let's sit down and let's put in a form of complaint, we don't. PALS complaints for most trusts are underrepresented. And actually, they're the way that they are audited. That's what CQC looks at. That's how they are held accountable. And that's where the actions have to be done. So actually, also as a community, we have to start moving forward. And, you know, the Ockenden report has come out, the Francis report, all these reports have come out because families have disagreed with the internal investigations and pushed for external investigations. And we as a community need to get stronger together to start holding to account.
Can I just bring Vijay in there? Because Vijay, you've been through this. And did you find it, I mean, you know, what you've done is really commendable, and you have the answers now that so many people haven't got just because of what Binash has said. So, you know, I know we need to sort of move on from this question, but if you could just share with us, that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, when Bhavna was in labour, what made her labour different was that she was having continuous pain. And very early on, she told the midwife that this pain is different. So our son, Jaden, was born 5 years earlier. So she'd been through labour before. She knew what labour pains was like and said to the midwife clearly, this is a different type of pain. Something's not right. And she was fobbed off. Everything's fine. Your baby's going to be here any minute. So they completely overlooked her pain and overlooked issues that she told them before, such as the excessive bleeding that she'd had. So I understand everything that's been said, and we felt that, both of us directly, that we were overlooked. Things that we said weren't taken seriously. They weren't listened to. We were fobbed off by the midwives and the doctors. Everything's fine. Your baby's going to be here. You know, one doctor said to us minutes before the C-section, he'd been doing this for 25 years and I'll be holding my baby in 2 minutes. You know, and it was 30 minutes later, he was still being resuscitated. It was just nobody listened and nobody looked at all the signs that were present. And in hindsight, it's all, you know, when an independent, like the coroner, looks at it through inquest, that's when it all becomes clear. Now, what I've struggled with the most is, even afterwards, when we've met with the lead midwives, the lead clinicians, they all told us in the weeks and months afterwards that nothing could have been done differently, that it was just the complication that we had. No one could have seen it. And they make you feel like you're going mad, because as a witness throughout the whole thing, I heard my wife tell them that something wasn't right. I saw the pain she was in. I saw the bleeding. They knew that there were decelerations and problems with Joshin's heart rate. It was all clear. but they kept on telling us afterwards we couldn't have done anything differently. And that's what hurts the most. We've lost our son, but we both said that we wanted to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. But you're fighting this brick wall with hospitals, doctors and midwives and all of their legal teams telling you, no, when, you know, nothing can be done differently until the coroner's inquest. And then they said, oh, actually, yes, you know, we should have had fetal scalp electrodes. We should have done, you know, the C-section earlier. And so it's exceptionally difficult, and definitely we weren't listened to.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. And I'm sure so many people can resonate with what you're saying. Sheetal, if I can just put this next question to you, and ask your experience of care in terms of family, friends, and the community. You know, was your baby, you know, you've had a miscarriage, and sadly, you know, you've lost Shivai at 8 months old. Could you tell me if, you know, this was spoken about, were you given the same care and regard that you would have received had, you know, you not had this miscarriage and you'd had a healthy baby, and if Shivai had survived?
I think the miscarriages were very different to when we lost Shivai. It was a different time. There was almost like a 10-year gap between the two. And even those 10 years, it was kind of like, you know, all these things happen, you know, at least you got pregnant, just try again, you know. And I think it was that intergenerational kind of how they coped with trauma and how they had been through things. And it was kind of like, just toughen up a little bit, you know. And I think also in my mind as well, I was grieving. I did go through kind of lots of postnatal kind of depression when I had my first son. I swept it underneath the carpet because I felt like a broken record, crying about it the whole time. And I just felt like I was banging on a brick wall, like no one was really there to sort of like talk about it. And around me, so many people were having first babies, second babies, third babies, you know, having their, in our culture, we do like an Indian baby shower. My first baby, he came 2 days before my baby shower was due, so I never actually had a baby shower. And then I remember after I'd had the miscarriages, going to a couple of like ceremonies like that. And, you know, they have like certain women that they kind of give a little gift to, and they ask them to sort of like bless, you know, the woman that's pregnant. And I just remember being sidelined very silently around that. And that hurt me the most. That hurt me the most, you know, because it was almost like saying, we don't want you around because it might happen to our family. And, you know, it was so like hurtful in some ways. And I just felt like I come from a massive family of friends and family. And I remember talking to my mum about it quite openly and getting really angry because she was the only one that I could really show my true kind of feelings to. And she understood, but also she'd never been through miscarriage. She'd never lost a child. You know, her experience was so different to my experience around getting pregnant and, you know, the pregnancy going through to full term. And, you know, both my boys were premature. So she'd never experienced, you know, having a baby in SCBU or in NICU, you know, and going through kind of having a baby and everybody around you wanting to celebrate your baby, but you actually don't know whether your baby's going to survive from the next hour. So you couldn't really celebrate anything that was happening. And it felt hugely lonely. And then when Shivai died, the experience was very different because obviously there was a funeral to plan for. And because he had been born, he had been alive for 8 months, it was a totally different situation. And they automatically went into, you know, that 1.5 months of kind of grieving and singing prayers and all that sort of stuff. And I remember the very first day they started doing it, my husband said, Mum, to the aunties, he said, Mum and aunties, I really respect what you're doing here, and I know you want to be here for us, but I can't have these prayers because they make me feel even more sad as to what's going on. And we already had Avi, who was 6 years old, and everything was happening at our house. Everybody was coming around to grieve and support us at home. And Karthik and I were very, very clear from the moment Shivai died that every decision that we made, we were going to make it based around what was going to be best for Avi in that moment. And so And so we kind of decided that, you know what, again, it comes back to these cultural kind of references and what you should do and what you shouldn't do. You know, during that time, you don't really eat nice food. During that time, you don't watch television, you don't have music on, all that sort of stuff. You only sing prayer songs that give you comfort, or the ones that you sing when someone passes away. And, you know, Karthik, my husband, it was incredible, because he was saying all the things that I really wanted to say, but I couldn't say.
He was your voice for that time.
He was my voice for that time.
Yeah, I think, you know, the other thing, you know, if I can just add to that, I know that Ansai and I have spoken about bone setting after pregnancy, and Banash and I have spoken about Panjiri, you know, this thing that's given to, you know, mothers, and so wholesome. But when I lost my son, my body had been through the same thing. Everything was the same. In fact, I needed that more, but that wasn't even a thought, because my son wasn't there. Those rituals also then, those beautiful rituals, they also are lost. And I think that's the really sad thing, because you don't actually think of what is needed at that time. And those little things really do impact.
Yeah, I think so a lot. And, you know, the only thing I remember at that time is we have to do what we have to do to get through this, or not get through this, but to manage what is going on for us right now, because there's not a written book that tells us how we should behave and how we shouldn't behave. You know, we just have to get through each day, step at a time, manage our own emotions and for others.
So we're really, this has been amazing, but we're so close to 7, and I have so many more questions to ask. So if it's okay with you, Saz, I'm just going to move to the next question, if that's okay. I know you have your hand up, but we can address other sort of questions in the next hour, if that's okay. Saz, actually, it was you that I was going to come to now. You and I lost our boys many years ago. Despite this, we know that yearning, longing and love remains. And sometimes this is hard for people to understand, as they feel we should have moved on, because they think, remembering our babies, you know, we're still in the same place and that's not good for us. What would you say to that?
It's really quite an interesting conversation that every time, but one of the things that's really quite, all three of my sons were born at the same time in January. And I'm okay when the birthdays are going on. And then February used to be my time when I used to get really down and depressive. And then I would mention our son, who is no longer with us. And then you would actually get a lot of people saying, well, look at your wonderful children. Look how beautiful they are. Look how healthy they are. You've had no problems conceiving them again. It's not the same, because I still think about him and have thought about him every February. The weather triggers a memory, a smell triggers a memory. He was in Hammersmith Skaboo for 10 days, and then we had him home with us. And so I used to take him to the park. And then I started taking my children to the same park, but I would go for a walk in the local park and the memory would trigger again. And people just don't seem to understand that you have lost a child. It doesn't matter 60 years, 50 years, you know, for a mother, it's a loss of a child, because you're so used to hearing everybody talking about the fact that only old people die. And then when you start talking about it a lot, I used to get shut off because, oh, they've just recently got married and they're trying to have children. You shouldn't be talking about that. So I actually didn't talk to any of my immediate family about it at all. I kind of buried it as deep as I could possibly can. And it was only because of what happened. My dad had a diagnosis for bone cancer, and we were given 3 months for him to live. And then everything came flooding back. And I became almost the woman I should have been when I'd lost my child at 8 weeks, and was crying all the time and couldn't eat. And, you know, and everybody was looking at me going, you know, he got 3 months, and why are you crying so much? But it wasn't just about my dad. It was crying about the child that we lost.
Because you weren't allowed to mourn at the time, I think. that's so important, isn't it? I think what you've said, it just shows how important it is to get the right care at that time, because you don't realize just how much is sort of buried within you. So yeah, thank you for sharing that, Sars. I'm just going to move on to Vijay, if I may, because you joining the panel today means so much, because you know we often hear the mother, but the father plays such an important role, and you know they are just as bereft, but you know they have to put on this sort of strong facade. And you know, I remember with my husband, he was broken, but he tried to carry on and be strong for me, for our parents, for our families. Do you feel this is what men do, to use this as their sort of coping mechanism, and also that they can't show how they're feeling because they need to be strong? And do you feel that men are not enabled or encouraged to show their grief?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the term you used to describe how your husband felt was broken, that sums it up completely. That's how you feel afterwards. When people ask you how you are broken, that's how I felt and still feel, you know. And I suppose you're right that you can grieve, but very much privately. And with myself and Bhavna, what we felt were there were days where she would be low and then you try and pick her up. But there'll be days when I would be low and she'd feel better. So we were kind of on that wave for a good few months afterwards, and even some days now. I think because Jaden was only 6 at the time, our son, a lot of my energy was focused on him to make sure he's not affected. And as much as I didn't want to go back to work, I had no choice. You had to work. You know, we had just moved house, and so you do distract yourself with other things, and you can't grieve openly per se. So it is very much to yourself. And I think it is difficult to find people to talk to. It's not that family and friends don't want to get involved. I think from their side, they don't know what to say without upsetting you. So I think it is very difficult for your friends and family to know what to say, particularly to me. So a lot doesn't get spoken about.
You're very right. And, you know, and Ansa has very rightly said that grieving never ends, but rather, you know, we grow around our grief. And that's something that, you know, is said in SANS a lot.